There's no doubt there's a bit of a clash between the privacy world and the AI world. I mean, for example, in privacy, we typically talk about data minimization, and data should only be kept as long as necessary, and you need to get rid of data. And in the world of AI, of course, the more data you have, the more precise the model will be. And again, if you want to remove biases from data, you need larger data sets, and that alone creates a bit of a conflict.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of The Future of Data Security. Today I'm speaking with Orrie Dinstein, Global Chief Privacy Officer at Marsh McLennan Companies. Orrie, thanks for chatting with me today.
Yep, pleasure to be here.
Great. So first thing, I've looked at your resume. You really have been around. You've seen all the movies. So I'm curious, after setting up multiple global privacy programs over 20 plus years, what's been the most surprising shift in how organizations approach data protection?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think back in the day, privacy was viewed very much as a check the box kind of program. You had to set up a few fairly limited elements in your program, and you could just say that you had done that. And I think there was more of a compliance focus of, again, here's 10 things you need to do and show me that you've done them. Over the years, there was an awareness of the value of data and the importance of data, which brought in a risk element to the programs. There was a lot more focus on risk. And again, and as the value of data became more important, and we've seen that in the latest evolution with AI, I think probably the biggest change is the understanding that privacy doesn't sit in isolation in a bucket. Privacy is, or data, personal data is a component of a much broader universe of data, which includes confidential data and client data, colleague data, vendor data, and commercial data. And all of that needs to be managed. And that's where we get into the world of information governance, where companies are starting to look at data from collection all the way through disposal. And again, including the analytics and the extraction of value from the data. And all that has resulted in a really different mindset when it comes to the handling of privacy programs.
I'm always amazed at how data isn't part of the balance sheet, yet it's such a valuable asset. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the biggest misconceptions that executives have about data privacy compliance?
Well, it's funny that you raised that question after you made the comment that you made about why data isn't on the balance sheet, and that's probably the biggest misconception that I have to deal with. Executives at companies tend to think that they own the data, and the reality is that companies are custodians of data. Now, you might be a controller. In some jurisdictions, there's this legal concept of a controller versus a processor, and as a controller, you have far more rights in the data, but at the end of the day, you're not the owner of the data. And so data is not an asset that you can put on your balance sheet. It's an asset that you have to work with, and you can do things with it. But at the end of the day, it's your data, it's my data, it's data that people have given you for a very specific set of purposes or uses, and it comes with strings attached. And that's the thing that people tend to forget, is that it's not their data.
You know, it's a great exemplar because you got me. And I think a lot of people think in those terms, the company's data, but you're right, it's on loan from consumers and data subjects. How do you then effectively structure a privacy program, especially across a global organization?
Yeah, that's probably the hardest thing to do for a large company, because the laws around the world tend to be very different from each other. They don't agree on hardly anything when you get into the weeds, but they do agree on a lot when you look at the principles. So, for example, many laws have the concept of data subject access rights, that an individual can access the data that a company holds about them. Now, again, when you start to compare the nuances, and you look at the GDPR versus the Brazilian LGPD, and you look at the POPI in South Africa, and you look at the law in India, um, the details are quite remarkably different. Even the definitions of what is personal data and what is sensitive data, all of that tends to vary. So it's easy to get lost in the weeds and find yourself that you're stuck. But if you extract yourself from the weeds and you look at the principles, and you can start to say, what are the guiding principles of data protection, privacy? And you start to say, well, these are the building blocks of a global privacy program. even if the nuances are different, but if you're complying at the sort of strategic level with the notion, again, that, for example, you need to do a privacy impact assessment when you're rolling out a new tool, you need to understand what data you're collecting, how it's being used, who it's being shared with, how long it's being stored, is there proper security? Again, you can look at various laws around the world and see that written in many different ways. But if you look just at that high level, and you put in place a program that says, I'm going to look at the privacy risk of tools and I'm going to do it once for the entire world, then you are probably satisfying that obligation, even if you're maybe missing some of the smaller nuances. What's interesting, I travel to a lot of global conferences and I meet a lot of global regulators and often chat with them about the various laws. And more than once, I've had a regulator say to me, you Americans read our laws way too closely. And the point is exactly what I've just said. Sometimes we tend to be very focused on the words, but this says this, and I have to do it this exact way. And regulators, maybe they wrote the words that way, but again, they're very focused on a higher level principle of be a good person, be fair, be transparent, right? So again, at its core, transparency is such an important value for privacy. But again, it's written in so many ways. You can say, well, this law says give this notice and that law says give that notice. But you know what? As long as you're giving notice, you're already a good person, right? So maybe you're not complying 100% with the law, but so to me, the key to success in a global program is to be able to extract what are those high level principles and push them out across the board and say,
Mm.
let's do 80% of our program as one program. There's things you have to customize, like appointing data protection officers is not something that's required everywhere. And where it is required, there are nuances, and you can't just take one person and say, oh, this is going to be my DPO for everywhere. So there are examples where you need to start to customize things. But again, I think finding commonalities principles is probably a critical piece.
You have a very unique global vantage point, and it's funny that you mention maybe other jurisdictions. I'm going to assume maybe in Europe, they're more about the spirit of these regulations, and in the US, it's more about the letter of the law. Why do you think that is? Is it based upon how litigious a specific country is? What drives these differences?
I think that some of it is just cultural. I mean, for example, if you look at the length of laws, right? I mean, in the US, you can find laws that are hundreds of pages long, and then there'll be thousands of pages of regulation to supplement the law. And look at European laws. I mean, the European Data Protection Directive, which was the first privacy law that the EU passed, actually in 2000, I think it was 25 pages long, and then it got replaced by the GDPR, which is maybe 120 pages long, depending on the formatting and so forth. But in US, legislative, comparison, these are very short laws. And the same is true on the contracts, right? I mean, again, in quite a few jurisdictions, a 5, 10 page contract is considered normal. And in the US, large companies, if they send you a master services agreement at less than 75 pages, then, they must be using a bad law firm.
Yeah.
So again, it's sort of in our culture that we like to spell everything out and we like to be very, very, very precise. And that because you assume that everything is written very precisely, we make a living out of finding loopholes, right? I mean, you look at the tax code. How many pages is the US tax code and how many interpretations are there of all the different exceptions? Because you assume that if you had something to say, you would say it, right? And if there was just a principle that said, you need to pay X% tax on your income, that could have been 90% of the tax code, right?
It's interesting, and the more legal there is, it becomes a self-licking ice cream cone that you have to produce more around that. Very well said on the, I think, dramatic change in landscape. There's definitely now very few safe harbors when it comes to data privacy and how businesses can operate with data. But with AI, Gen AI in particular, it's almost a perfect storm of major changes. So, what are your thoughts on balancing this regulatory compliance with business innovation and the desire to drive, new things that do have a massive advantage, provide a massive advantage to organizations?
That's probably the toughest issue to balance for companies, how to juggle between laws and innovation. In fact, if you tried to comply with the GDPR from cover to cover, you would probably end up shutting down your business and finding that you just can't operate. Again, first of all, you have to go back and look at principles and try to say what are they really trying to get at here? What are the bad things that I need to stay away from, and where do I think that there's some wiggle room. But you mentioned AI is with specific to AI. There's no doubt there's a bit of a clash between the privacy world and the AI world. I mean, for example, in privacy, we typically talk about data minimization, and data should only be kept as long as necessary, and you need to get rid of data. And in the world of AI, of course, the more data you have, the more precise the model will be. And again, if you want to remove biases from data, you need larger data sets. And that alone creates a bit of a conflict. And of course, applying principles like DSARs to LLMs is impossible, because once you create an LLM, you can't go in and remove Orrie's data from the LLM. That's it. You can create a new LLM and throw the other one out. But the cost of creating an LLM is massive. And so you can't just come in and say, remove my data from that data set. Once it's been trained on your data, that's it. And there's many other areas where it's really hard to reconcile the privacy laws with the AI laws, and that's where there are questions
Mm.
where regulators are trying to figure out where to draw the right balance. And of course, in most places, there's a desire not to choke innovation and not to prevent companies from innovating. But I also find that sometimes the mantra of innovation should trump regulation can lead to bad behavior. There's no doubt quite a few tech companies in the US that have pushed the envelope of privacy well beyond what most people think is fair. And yet every time that they get pulled to the mat by the regulators, they're like, "Oh, if you come after me, then you're choking innovation." So you have to strike the balance between allowing a certain amount of innovation while not harming individuals. And with AI as well, there's the jury is still out on whether AI is a harmless kind of thing that we should let it grow, or whether it's whether we're on path to Terminator, where AI is going to take over the world and control all of us. And depending on which camp you're in, you probably will set your expectations in terms of, oh, let the AI guys play with AI. It's harmless and it's beneficial. Or you're going to say, I'm a little bit nervous about what's happening here. Can we all just stop? So it's a very, very difficult one. But again, always have to go back and say, what's the worst thing that's going to happen, right? In terms of
Yeah,
like
yeah.
who's going to get hurt and how badly are they going to get hurt? And if you don't like the answer to that, then you should probably take a pause on what you're doing.
It's funny. Recently, we've been renewing some agreements and reviewing MSAs and DPAs, and I've definitely seen an uptick in the quality and quantity of questions around, like, "Hey, what are you exactly doing with the data?" So I can feel that change. Switching gear a little bit, I had a great mentor. Actually, was an American. He worked at McKinsey, kind of Harvard MBA type of background, and he used to tell me, "Jean, it's always management's fault when something goes off the rails." So in that line of thinking, how do you manage the relationship between the CPO and the CISO within global organizations facing this major change with AI, facing data privacy requirements, and requiring the means to put all of this together with security technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. A CISO is probably the most important partner that you can have as a chief privacy officer, because we're both very much aligned on a mission of protecting the data of the company. Of course, the CISO has a different remit and exercises that role in a different way than a privacy officer does. But ultimately, there is a huge amount of overlap, and certainly whenever there's data breaches or anything that happens that looks like suspicious behavior on the inside, on the outside, there's a strong need for correlation. And also, many of the security programs have privacy invasive components to them. I mean, obviously, when you want to monitor your employees, if you want to put CCTV cameras all over the office, if you want to monitor all email activity or pull records from web browsing and so forth, I mean, you can have really good security, but it would come at a cost of the privacy of the individual. So it's really important for the CPO and the CISO to be well connected and in regular touch with each other. And I sometimes talk to my peers and they're like, "Oh, I have a monthly call with my CISO. We're very well connected." And I always say, if you're waiting a whole month to talk to your CISO, then one of you is not doing his job or her job. While I do have a standing call with my CISO just to make sure that we have that regular touch point to talk about other stuff, but there's not a week that goes by that we don't talk or share emails and exchange views on day-to-day things that are coming up. And then you've got things that are more thematic, less urgent, not sort of the emergency of the week, and then those we can catch up on our monthly call. But very, very important to manage that relationship and to be and to be on good terms with your CISO.
Things have changed rapidly, and I guess in a perfect world moving forward, how would you describe that next evolution of privacy leadership? What would that look like? And have you seen also things that don't look so good?
Well, so again, I think the biggest evolution is that we're moving to more of a data governance or information governance kind of world, with AI becoming a critical piece of understanding what data you have and how to use the data in a way that's effective. And increasingly, I'm seeing the role of the CPO evolving away from being very narrowly defined as privacy to becoming more focused on information governance and, again, data analytics and data monetization. Right. I mean, what's interesting is when you look at data, there's a piece of it which is how do I keep the data secure, but there's a flip side of it, which is how do I make money off of it? Because to your point, I mean, it's certainly not my saying. Data is the new oil. This is many companies, even manufacturing companies, and certainly companies that don't manufacture anything like our company. As our CEO says, I mean, we don't build anything. We're a professional services company. We basically live off of data and giving advice. And so it's critical to understand that ecosystem and not just limit yourself to the world of privacy, right? I mean, I can give you a big contract and you might say, "Oh, I looked at the privacy clause in section 12 and here's my comments." And it's like, great, but there's a contract, right? You need to understand the whole relationship and everything that's happening in that ecosystem. And you can't just be too narrow in thinking about the privacy clause.
There are probably many CEOs, CTOs out there that want to drive a very aggressive adoption of AI or a very aggressive use of data. And the last thing they want to hear is, hey, the blocker is going to be data privacy X or data security Y. What's been your most successful strategy for getting buy-in, generating alignment with business leaders on privacy initiatives? And I don't know if you want to talk about privacy by design, but if you do, please add that into it.
The most important thing is for them to understand that you're on their side and your job is to get them to a yes. I always tell people privacy is rarely a showstopper. Privacy is a guardrail and it's a hurdle that if you do the right things, you can climb over that hurdle. It's rarely a wall that you can't get to the other side. So once they understand that my job is to get them to the other side, I'm on the journey with them, I'm taking them, I'm here to help them get safely to the place that they want to go, then the collaboration becomes fantastic. If they view you as the Department of No, you're the person who's coming in to kill the project, you're the person who's there to tell them all the reasons why they can't do what they want to do, they're going to hide from you. They're going to try to avoid you, right? So I think that's probably the most important thing, is to learn to partner with people and to make sure that they understand that you're vested in their success. You're not here to help them fail. And privacy by design is a critical part of our privacy program and of any privacy program, because, again, once you understand what's important in the world of privacy and you set those parameters and you force people to work inside those parameters, it's there for their protection. There's an old saying that brakes were invented not to slow down cars, but to allow cars to go faster. which is actually the first time you hear that. It's actually a mind-boggling kind of thought because you don't think of it that way. Normally, you think of a brake as something to slow down your car, but that's actually what allowed cars to be able to go much faster. So if you think of privacy as exactly the same way, we are the brake that allows you to run faster by putting in that safety measure that will help you get to your destination faster. And following a privacy by design program is better than running, then stumbling, then discovering that you did things poorly, going back to square one to fix the things that you could have fixed and should have fixed at the beginning, and then going back to where you were. That's a very slow journey.
You know, Ari, that's probably the smartest thing I've heard this week. So I've got a few days left to go, but I'm going to use that one for sure. I really like this. You know, having a means to stop is how we can actually go faster. Having a safety net with data privacy, it's how we'll be able to do better, more impressive things with data. First time I've heard that, I think it's really clever. Talking about, you know, measurements, what are the most effective ways in your view, to measure the success of a privacy awareness program, of a data privacy program?
I'm not in love with measurements for privacy programs. To me, the measurements fall into two categories. One is, let's just call it productivity measurements. Like I can tell you how many DSARs my team did last month. I can tell you how many privacy program reviews, applications we reviewed last month. Those are things that, how many contracts we negotiated. Those are things that don't really provide much insight other than productivity. You do have numbers that are perhaps more interesting, but we don't really control them. Like how many data breaches did you have last month, right? But A, I don't control exactly what the breaches are going to be. But second, and this again is something that's a bit counterintuitive, so maybe this will be the second intelligent thing that you heard this week. It's not necessarily a good thing when somebody comes to you and says, we have zero breaches or zero complaints, right? At first, when you're sort of new to this, you think, how do we drive that number down to as close to zero as possible? But what you might be missing in the process is that the number is low because people just don't have the awareness to report, or they're afraid to report because they know that when they report, they might get in trouble. So you might look at that zero breaches, zero complaints. Some of these numbers are numbers that you actually want them to be at a certain healthy level, because that tells you that the organization is aware of their obligations. There's no way that a large organization is processing data and not having data losses or data breaches or data mishaps, right? Everyone sends an email to the wrong person at some point. You're sending thousands of emails. At some point, you're going to make a mistake. Even if you operate close to perfection, Six Sigma is about as close to perfection as you get. Six Sigma is 6 defects per million. So think of a large organization, every million emails, 6 emails went to the wrong person. So if you're not getting any complaints, then something is wrong. But then the question is, great, what if you're getting 1,000 complaints? Is that too much? So I still haven't figured out where the right number is. That's why I hate that I'm reporting on that number, because I still haven't figured out how to make something meaningful of it. So I'm still in the hunt for meaningful ways to assess the effectiveness of my program.
You know, it reminds me, I'm a bit of a history buff, and during the Second World War, they had airplanes coming back with certain patterns. And then they said, you know, we're going to reinforce the planes where there are the most holes. But there was a survivor bias, because, in fact, the planes that weren't making it were hit in all these areas and would crash. So it's really interesting to think about the available data and what should we derive as a conclusion.
That's a great point.
Maybe to wrap things up for the audience, if you were to give some advice to a younger or a new professional starting in the space, what would be some of your best pearls of wisdom, your best movies that you could share?
First one is probably to be humble. There's so much that we need to know, and so much that we need to think about, and so much that we need to understand. And it's so easy to get things wrong. And I think that especially, in my younger days, I tended to be a lot more quick to jump to conclusions, to spit out answers, to prove my knowledge and how smart I was, only to later be humbled by realizing that I didn't think about a certain angle, or that there was actually a nuance that changed the value of the answer. So I've learned to talk in a lot more. Not that you want to be ambiguous. Nobody likes ambiguous answers, right? When executives come to you for advice, they need a path forward. but you can still talk about things with a certain way of, based on what you're telling me. And as I understand the facts of the project, it seems that this would be the right way forward. And I'm open to discussing it. And then as you have that live dialogue, you can better understand what's happening and give perhaps more precise advice than spewing off a, no, don't do it, or yeah, this looks good. And just appreciate that there's more you need to know. Probably the second thing would be get in the weeds on technology. I mean, I'm not a coder, I'm not a tech person, but over the years, I've learned to go deep into the technology to understand things, to get the language and the terminology, which allows you to talk to tech people in a way that makes the partnership better and also makes you a more effective privacy professional. All too often, I see lawyers who talk, they still use Latin terms and they talk in ways that IT people don't understand, and tech people talk in acronyms and terms that lawyers don't understand. And you just see that there's a lack of communication there that stems from just lack of a common language. And if you can learn their language and change your way of speaking in a way that they understand. For example, when I hire new people on my team, I always tell them that probably one of the biggest things that they need to understand is that lawyers think in gray. Everything is on the one hand, on the other hand, maybe this, maybe that. IT people think in black and white, like 0, 1, up, down, yes, no, turn it on, turn it off. So they have to code things, right? When you come to them and say, oh, you have to apply proportionality, it's like, how do you code proportionality into a system? It's like, no, 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 no. Give me what you want and I will write it into code and that system will do it. But so you have to learn to talk and think in a totally different way and bridge that gap. And once you learn that, then you can be a much more effective privacy professional. By the way, I think you asked about a movie. I love Minority Report. I think that Report is probably the best privacy-driven movie that I've seen. Very thought-provoking. But even more so, there's a book called The Circle, which became a movie. I would have recommended that movie, but the movie is not nearly as good as the book. So if anyone wants to read a very thought-provoking book about privacy and where the world is going, it's a book from probably 5, 6 years ago, but very, very close to where we are and the path that we're pursuing with some of our social media stuff. And it's just a great read.
Yeah, I forgot about that movie with precognition and trying to prevent crimes. It's in fact really thought-provoking and forward-leaning.
Yes.
Very good advice. Unfortunately, that's all we're going to have time to cover for today. Before we wrap, if people want to follow along with your work, your publications, is there a best place for them to go and follow you?
I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. I lurk on other social media, but I don't post much. I'm one of those people who for various reasons, is not a big fan of social media. So I engage in it just enough to understand it and be able to talk about it and understand the ramifications, right? You can't be the person who's standing at work and saying, oh, we should ban this platform, and you don't know what the platform does, right? So I lurk on many platforms, but I don't like to actively use them. So best to connect with me on LinkedIn.
No, and I'm the same. I have a big bucket of popcorn and I'm scrolling through, but I never say anything.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, this has really been a fun conversation. I'm sure people will appreciate it. I've learned a lot, at least one or two really smart things. And let's keep in touch. And thank you again for joining the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.